HVAC 360, episode number 20. Prefunctional checklists for building commissioning. Welcome everybody to another edition of HVAC 360. I am your host, Matt Nelson. This week we're going to talk about a little back to basics, prefunctional checklists when we're talking about building commissioning. Now, these are some of the more basic forms that I use in the commissioning process, that are used in the commissioning process. They are some of the, and they can be some of the most difficult parts of building commissioning. As those who have commissioned buildings before will understand, prefunctional checklists involve cooperation from contractors. That can be something that's a little bit tough to come by, second only to getting issues resolved. That can be a big hang-up that really drags on and makes the commissioning authority's job really, really difficult. But I want to talk about the prefunctional checklist from the standpoint of ASHRAE Guideline 0 and from the PECI. And as I was kind of going over the notes to this, I'm like, well, okay, maybe not everybody knows what PECI stands for. That's the Portland Energy Conservation, Inc. They're really kind of, if you look at commissioning in general, they seem to be at the forefront there of some of the first studies, the first seminars, and getting the building commissioning, what are they called? Conventions put together. So they're actually a nonprofit organization, and I find some of their stuff very useful and very valuable to look at. If you want more information about PECI, you can go to their website. That's just peci.org. So the forms of these prefunctional checklists come in various sizes and shapes and contents. There was really no hard and fast rules. Pretty much everything that you'd read about are like, basically cover A, B, and C, and you're good. So make them, what you want. PECI definitely has a good structure to follow. ASHRAE Guideline 0 has a little bit more ambiguous structure that you can follow as well. And I'll get into that a little bit more as I go through this. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to boil down the anatomy of these forms and into something that you can digest. Okay, well, that sounds kind of gross, but maybe it's a bad analogy. You understand. So what are prefunctional checklists? Prefunctional checklists, there's a lot of different names you could give them. The prefunctional checklists, prefunctional forms. There's construction checklists. That's something that the ASHRAE verbiage is in Guideline 0. They call them construction checklists. I have the personal take to just call them prefunctional checklists. They're checklists that need to be complete before you do your functional testing. So it's very descriptive. I think everybody pretty much has that acceptance of something they've heard before. Construction checklists may tend to confuse some people, but I think prefunctionals is pretty much accepted throughout the industry. Now, these forms, by definition, these forms are to be used by the contractor to verify that the appropriate components are on site, ready for installation, correctly installed, and functional. Now that comes from Guideline 0. That's really what the definition of what a prefunctional checklist should be. Really, when I get into a pre-commissioning meeting with contractors, I like to tell them, these are forms that you're supposed to fill out. I mean, basically, it's things that you're already doing, and it's just really a documented way of saying, yes, I've done what I should do, everything's ready, go ahead and test it out. Now, they typically cover both, prefunctional checklists can cover both equipment, components, or they can test entire systems or assemblies. The if you're talking about equipment, chillers, pumps, if you talk about systems, heating, water piping, chilled water piping, things like that. And remember, here's something to remember if you're looking at pre-functional checklists. Not every one of the pieces of equipment or systems that have a pre-functional checklist will require functional test procedures. If they're not that complex, if they're standalone, they will just have the pre-functional checklist, and you're good to go. So not every system and component has both, but most of them, all of them will have that pre-functional checklist. So why? Why do we do this? Obviously, the short answer is most of the time it's required. But, that's not always a great answer. I think the best answer is that it puts the contractor on record saying, yes, he's done these things, he's checked these things out, he's signed off on them, and it's a clear signal to the commissioning authority that the equipment is ready for testing. So I think it goes a little bit deeper in that, and that's what I try to do with my pre-functional checklist. It really goes and becomes a repository for some critical information. Becomes like a little roadmap of the design and construction. So I'm going to go into that a little bit later. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy. Now we have, obviously, I'll compare these two for you. You have ASHRAE Guideline 0. You have the PECI documents. Guideline 0, as I mentioned before, is not very descriptive. It doesn't have a lot of meat, so to speak. It really just provides an outline saying, okay, here's kind of the look of the tables that you should have. It should have certain sections. But, again, it's a standard that you have to pay for. Sold by, go to the ASHRAE bookstore. You can download a electronic copy or buy actually a hard copy if that's the way, if that's what you prefer. Not a bad document to get. If you're in if every commissioning authority should have a copy of Guideline 0 laying around the office somewhere. So, but I don't think it's a great place to really get a lot of detail about the pre-functional checklists. PECI, on the other hand, is very descriptive, and it's also free. So again, if you go to the PECI.org website, you can download some of these. The one thing that I'm going to caution you on is that these forms, when you look at them, they're really overly cumbersome. They're not visually neat. It's very technical. I guess I get a hard time describing it, but when you look at it, it's very confusing. So if it's confusing to an engineer who has to sit down and look at it and analyze it, if you give it to a contractor just from the PECI website, they're going to roll their eyes. They're going to throw it in their job box. It's not going to see the light of day until you absolutely start screaming over it. So really, I guess what I want to tell you now is that you need to remember, you need to make the forms as simple as possible to get as much information across. The more likely, if you do that, the more likely it is going to be filled out by the contractor. So the different components, if you were talking about, the structure for Guideline 0, the Guideline 0, they start off with some instructions, basically, telling the contractors how to fill out these forms, everything like that. They have a model verification section, which is actually pretty consistent between both Guideline 0 and PECI. They have a pre-installation checks, they have installation checks, and then they have a conflict section. So basically the pre-installation checks is when it gets to the job site, is it abused? Does it look like it's been dropped? Just making sure that the contractors checked over the piece of equipment, that when they accept it and they install it, that there's not anything potentially wrong with it that shouldn't be addressed right then and there. Obviously, the installation checks, those are once it's installed, and then the conflicts, anything that's wrong with the equipment that would prevent it from being functionally tested. That's really what they want to focus on. What are the conflicts that need to arise? Moving on to the PECI forms, they have a basically it's split up into the submittal of the pre-functional checklist forms by the contractor, the approval, and both of these are kind of sign-off, signature, sign and date kind of things. They have the approval by the commissioning authority. They have requested documents area. They have a model verification, again, similar to the ASHRAE Guideline 0, installation checks, and operational checks. Now, looking at both of these, it's a little bit easier to start with the PECI documents and kind of mold them into, whatever you want. That's something that I've done. I use, the submittal of the approval, the model verification, the install, and the operational checks. Those are kind of the four components that I think that, at least in my opinion, those are the crucial ones, and I kind of explain each one of those in a little bit more detail. So when we're talking about submittals and approvals, I think that the PECI documents have some great instructions as far as what the submittal from the contractor needs to be. Really, they state that checklists are the checklist items are to be completed and checked off only by parties having direct knowledge of the events. Now, basically, what they're spelling out here is that they don't want the project manager who is sitting at a desk somewhere, who is the person who actually orders the equipment, has it shipped to the job site. They don't want to have that person checking off the fact that yes, it was checked for leaks, or we've had the the pump aligned, or just the different things that only guys in the field, technicians, superintendents, only those guys would really have direct knowledge of those things being actually done. They really don't want this, and it's very critical not to have these pre-functional checklists rubber stamped by somebody that they just check. Yep, it's all good. You're good. Good to go. Functional test it, and then you start functional testing, and you start finding things that are wrong with them. So that's when the only, even have it underlined, only by parties having direct knowledge of the event. It's really that critical. When you talk about the approval process, now, I think both the checklists, there's going to be a couple of different things with the approval process. The commissioning authority is either going to take a look at the pre-functional checklist that's been submitted, and they're going to check it for completeness. And if it's a complete, they're going to say, okay, well, we're good to go. Or they're going to take it and say, all right, now I'm going to go out in the field, and for a certain percentage of these pieces of equipment, I'm going to go and check them personally, just to make sure that things are on the up and up. Again, it's kind of a quality process, just to make sure that everything is done okay. Now, moving on to model verification. Now, model verification, this is something that if you look at the finer points of the PECI documents, these are some of the more critical components. This is one of those, places where it provides a good roadmap for the project. And here's what I mean by that. This form, and it really confused me for the longest time, and I've gone through a couple of iterations of this, but it will have on the documents basically what you have. You'll have, like, say for example, the model number and the manufacturer. They're going to have like a little 1, 2, and 3 by each one of these categories, and what the 1, 2, and 3 mean is the 1 means what the piece of equipment was in design. So you take the design and you'd write it down in the 1 slot, and you go all the way down and you'd write in as much information as you could about that from the different schedules that were on the drawings or things like that. The little 2 would say, okay, now you get the submittal. And that is the submittal check, so it's basically back-checking, comparing the submittals to what was in the design. Now you get to the third stage, and that number 3 was what it is when it was actually installed. Now, I look at that and I said, well, that's a lot of busy work. I mean, it's just get what it is as installed and you've checked it all along the way, so what's the big deal? Well, you know what? It really actually provides that good roadmap that what you saw in design. If there's any changes, whether they be changes to the different options to the piece of equipment, or whether they bump the motor horsepower up, and then that's something that it should trigger you to look in on your electrical drawings to kind of cross-check those type of things and see what was actually installed. So it gives you a simple place to really look and analyze each and one of those pieces of information. And once you get it down from the drawings to the pre-functional checklist, once you get that information, it's a lot easier, and I think a very more definitive way of checking your submittals. And that's a lead criteria, is that you check your submittals. So it's a documented way of checking your lead submittals. It's right there in your pre-functional checklist. You don't really have to do any other pieces of paperwork. You just spell it out when your final report saying that I reviewed the submittals, and that documentation is in my pre-functional checklist on the model verification form. So really it provides you that easy way of just, instead of having to, take the submittal and then, fumble back through the different detail sheets and the different schedule sheets on the drawings. It provides you a single point where you're just continuously updating that information on that one form, and that gives you a clear way of being able to specify that information. So, and whether or not you actually get all that information yourself, at least in the stage 3 in construction, that's kind of up to you. I've gone through and again, making it what's the simplest thing for the contractor to fill out. They sometimes they're like, well, going around to all the pieces of equipment, and it's kind of a pain in the butt to be able to for them to do, and it's a nice back check to kind of every time you're checking the installation anyway of the equipment. Why not, once it's installed, take your pre-functional checklist, just fill out that form while you're there, and that's one thing less that you have to request and interpret, and that way you can get it in typing and type it onto the form. You don't have to read anybody's handwriting. It becomes a lot simpler, and just rely on the contractors just to have those installation checks, those operation checks. Just have them fill that piece of information out. Now, when you go into the install section, installation checks, again, just to kind of give you an idea of what, some of the installation checks, this is, making sure that, the casing's in good condition, the fins on some of the heat transfer coils haven't been damaged. You're looking for, fit and finish, making sure that all the things that, all the different components and sensors that were on the drawings actually show up in the final piece of equipment install. Making sure that the details were followed by the contractors. Those types of things are integral to the installation checks. Now, when you have, I guess part of the issue is you're going to have multiple contractors going over this. So you get back to that point where, okay, only those people responsible for having installed the equipment or those pieces and parts have those fill them out. Well, it's not going to be the same contractor installing the piece as it is going to be wiring up the piece. Is the same as the person going to be wiring the controls. So there's really going to be 3 separate contractors that you could potentially have on a single piece of equipment, possibly even more. You don't know. And what you need to be able to do if you're going to have these separate contractors responsible for checking out these pieces of equipment, I would recommend that you break those installation checks into installation checks by mechanical, installation checks by electrical, installation checks by temperature controls, and kind of spell that out, get that in there for them to make sure that is all in line and that they understand, okay, it's this section. A lot of times, especially if you look on the basic PECI document, they'll have a column in there that says contractor, and that's where you're supposed to fill in exactly who does this. But I think that's, you need to digest it as much as you can. So I would even go as far as taking those sections and blocking them out and making just complete these 5 checks. You make it as dirt simple as you can for the contractors. It's not something that they won't think that you're talking down to them. It's just, okay, they like to see, okay, this is, these 15 steps, that's all I have to check, and then my job's done. They need it spelled out for them, and they definitely appreciate when you do that. So it's not ambiguous to anybody. It's not confusing. So when you talk about the next step, the next phase is the operational checks. Again, if it's a basic piece of equipment, this is, you're going to go through these and that's going to be it. Really, is it connected? Is it powered up? Does it turn on and off? Does it cycle through the, do all the high-speed, high-low-speed fan options on cabinet unit heaters work? Does the light switch activate the lights? It really can be that simple, and these are just kind of basic functions. They're not to get into any sequences. That's for the functional test forms. If it has a sequence of operation, it's going to have a functional test procedure for that piece of equipment. But operational checks are basically you're bumping the motor, does it turn in the right direction, are you getting flow, those types of basic things. So really kind of that's the anatomy of this. So the whole goal is to develop your forms, and you really, if you look at the time frame of when you're supposed to be doing these, develop them early on in the process. You should be doing these you should get the list together, when you're doing some of your work in the design phase. Get them together. Know what the list of the pre-functional checklist forms are going to be. Start developing them. When you get the bid documents, that's when you can start filling out those model verifications that I was talking about a little bit ago. But you want to make sure, and here's one of these things, you want to make sure that you get the forms integrated into what the contractor is required to do. So that means not only do you want to have it in your specifications, saying that, okay, all contractors that are going to be that have systems that are involved in commissioning are going to be responsible for completing some of the checklists, and you're going to give them to them. Not only doing that, but you reiterate to them. So you get it in the specifications. Then you tell them at the pre-bid meeting. You tell them at the pre-commissioning meeting when you're in construction, and then I would even go as far as actually trying to work it in to their their schedule of values. And what I mean by that is that contractors get paid based on work they're required to do. So if they don't complete something, if the general contractor or the construction manager doesn't receive work that they're expecting that's been documented for, if they don't get that paperwork, they're not going to get paid. It's just like another submittal for them. If they don't get submittals, if they don't get O&Ms, they're not going to get paid. Tie it to that, because you really, when a contractor pays attention, it's usually about money. And if it's not required in the contract, they're not going to do it. They're not going to waste their time to do it if they can't be made to do it. And really, this is something that you just want to say, okay, you know what, this is just like everything else. It's not special. You don't want to make a big deal about it, but you do want to have that hard-coded into the whole project so that you can get that information back from them. So again, you want to keep it simple for the contractor. I mean, it even goes as far as if you read Guideline 0, ASHRAE has it in there. You want to keep it simple for the contractors. You want to make sure that you get this valid information back from the field. And even, I think that they even go to the extent of saying you know what, when you're making these checks, these pre-functional checks, they suggest that questions be worded so that they're clear and that the correct answer is typically yes. So when you do that, you avoid a lot of problems. Some other tips you can have is be careful of the rubber stamping. Again, I mentioned that earlier, but one of the things that I like to do to avoid that is not to have checks in a checklist. I know it's kind of, I guess, contradictory. You'd think a checklist, I want to have checks, but I would say use words. Have them use words. So does it pass? Yes, or no. If the thing is, complete, pass, fail. Use words like that. Or not applicable, or by others. Have them use words when filling out the forms. So don't use checks or X's. I think that's just kind of confusing. Some people, it's just too tough. If you have a yes or no, there's not a lot of ambiguity about that. Also, you want to make sure that I guess another thing that you could do to make sure that you keep it simple for the contractors is not to overwhelm them. You could go into the commissioning meeting, the pre-construction commissioning meeting, and just lay just a whole boatload of forms on them. But you might want to think about actually just kind of batch feeding them, giving them whenever something is done. Hey, I'll give you this form. You give it back to me, and we'll check it off, and we'll be okay. So don't give them everything at once. That way, it doesn't give them an opportunity to throw it in the job box and lose it. There's a number of times when I've given pre-functional checklists to contractors 5 and 6 times. It gets ridiculous a lot of times. The project managers they can't keep a hold of it, for that long. So I think even to that just have just a one-page tracking form, just something that you're looking for the contractor to provide. So it really kind of gives, again, just kind of more of another roadmap for the contractor to follow that says, okay, here's where I'm at, here's what I have left to do, and just kind of check through them. So when you have commissioning meetings, you can kind of use that as a reference point, saying, okay, I've given you these pre-functionals, I expect them back. Once you're done with that, I can give you some new ones, just to kind of have that relationship. And obviously, excuse me, things are going to work differently for different contractors. You're going to have find a kind of a routine that works best for you. But again, this is one of those frustrating parts when you're relying on other people to do your work. This is work that typically they haven't done in the past. Now, that may change in the future where they get more used to it, and that's a fortunate place to be. But really, one of the frustrating parts is trying to get work back from somebody else that you need to get done. So I think I've pretty much covered it all that I need to for now for the pre-functional checklists for building commissioning. All right, so I guess those are my tips and comments. I don't know if you have any of them that you've learned from in the past that you can apply, or even just let me know, and I can share some of those with with our listeners. I really appreciate any comments that you'd have. So also, if you have if you want some reminders of the past episodes or a little bit of insider information, don't forget I do actually have a monthly newsletter that I've started sending out. It's not so much a newsletter, but there might be a few tips and tricks depending on how I'm feeling that at that particular moment. But you can go to my blog at buildingx.co and sign up for it right there. And I put that out on a monthly basis just to keep you up to date and figure out, what we've been issuing. So, if that's pretty much all I have for today. Remember, you can follow me on Twitter if you want, BuildingX, and I have a blog at buildingx.co where you can listen to these episodes. You can point your friends to those pages. If you find this interesting, please share them with others. I love growing my audience. I really appreciate you all listening, and I just do this to share what I know with everybody else. So, until next time, remember, know what you build and share what you know.